How much time is remaining for the Republican morning business?
15 minutes and 20 seconds.
Thank you. It's interesting days in our country. We find ourselves in a very deep hole. And it's not the American people's fault, it's Congress's fault. We continue to spend money that we don't have on things that we don't need. And when we do that personally, we end up filing bankruptcy. Pretty soon we run out of new credit cards to take on, and we get to the point where we can't pay our debts. And that's the question that's in front of our country today. As our economy is struggling, we have this massive debt, and we ought to be about every small, medium, and large thing we can do to solve the problem. Not to solve the problem to say that we can't pay our bills, but to solve the problem so we create a prosperous future for our kids and those that follow us. Now, there's a lot of controversy over the amendment that I offered, and it's claimed by the majority leader inaccurately that this amendment was Rule 14. It wasn't Rule 14. According to the procedures of the Senate, you can file a cloture on any amendment at any time. That's a privilege that every senator has here. Now, why would somebody file a cloture on an amendment? It's because over the first 5.5 months of this year, through the leadership of the Senate, we've been unable to have a free and open debate and free and open offering of amendments. So this isn't, because the procedure is rarely used doesn't mean it's not ethical and not accurate. Matter of fact, the reason the procedure was put there is in case at the point in time when your rights as a senator to offer amendment are being limited by the majority. That's why we have this rule, because you can take 16 of your colleagues and file a cloture petition and therefore have a vote on your amendment. So what we're hearing going on in the background today is the reason you shouldn't vote for this amendment, even though you agree we should get rid and save $3 billion, much as the senator from California outlined, $3 billion that the very people who are blending and receiving the $3 billion don't want. The argument is because they don't like the way the amendment came to the floor. Well, explain to the people at home, when you have an opportunity to save this country $3 billion, and you know it's the right policy, but you're not going to vote for it because you don't like the way the amendment came to the floor. And I would remind my colleagues that of the $3 billion we're going to save, $1.2 billion of it we're going to borrow from China if we go on and spend it. And we're going to charge that $1.2 billion to our kids and our grandkids. The interesting thing is that we have grown over 20-some years to rely on ethanol for 7% of our fuel. And it's been a very expensive process. It's expensive directly because when you go to buy gasoline today, it's not the price you pay at the pump that you're actually paying. You take all the subsidies and all the tax credits and all the low-interest loans and all the non-repayment of all the grants and all the monies that have been put into this program, and when you buy that tank of gas, every gallon that you put into your car, after you pay for it, you already paid $1.72 through your taxes to have that gallon there. So we're not getting rid of the mandate on ethanol. It's 7.5%. It has helped us in some ways. It's a very inefficient fuel. It causes us to consume more fuel, produce more CO2. But the fact is we have an amendment on the floor that is designed to take away a subsidy, and the only reason we're taking away the subsidy is because in law we're saying you have to do it anyway. And I would introduce for the record a letter from the refiners who state, this is the National Petroleum Refiners Association, who represent 97% of the people who get this tax credit. All right, 97% of the $3 billion, they say they don't want the $3 billion. Now, the vote's going to come down to really clear. We're going to give $3 billion to some of the most profitable companies in America, or we're not. The interesting thing is they're saying, please don't give it to us. Please don't give us this money. Now think at a time when we're borrowing the money to give to them, and they're saying, don't give it to us. We're going to have a vote on the floor and very likely not win because of a procedure or because of parochial interests. The fact is every gallon of ethanol that's blended to gasoline, whoever does the blending gets 45 cents a gallon. And they don't need it because they're going to blend it anyway. So the real question is will we continue to be ignorant in Washington of what the common sense that the American people want us to have? And the common sense is that if you're paying somebody to do something, and by law they have to do it anyway, and then they write you a letter and say, please don't pay me anymore to do this, I'm going to do it for you anyway, why would we continue to send them the money? Why would we continue to do that? Especially when 40% of it we have to borrow from the Chinese to be able to pay it to the American oil company. It makes no sense. There's no logic that you can come up with. The calculations out of Iowa State University on this $3 billion is that the amount of jobs that have come out of this in the past cost $14 million a year a job. $14 million a year per job created out of this subsidy. No wonder we're broke. No wonder we're failing financially. No wonder we're failing our children and our grandchildren because we continue to do things that don't have any correlation with logic or common sense. And I know the arguments. I know the argument is that, well, we passed this last year as part of the extension. Well, as a Republican, I was one of the few Republicans that didn't vote for that extension. Because not only did we pass additional tax cuts and additional unpaid programs, we cut no spending to be able to pay for it. So all we did was borrow a whole bunch more money and not solve any of the critical issues that lie in front of our country. 40% of last year's corn crop went to ethanol. Matter of fact, there's so much ethanol production. Last year, we shipped 400 million gallons overseas. That's great, except when you take the time to think about that with that 400 million gallons, we sent $500 million worth of subsidy. So now we're subsidizing the ethanol that goes to Europe with your tax dollars so they can have cheaper gasoline than we have because they're taking $1.72 per gallon and getting the benefit of our tax dollars to have cheaper ethanol in Europe than they can get from other places. So there's nothing about this that makes sense other than if you're a wonk and study the politics and the procedures and the parochialism that goes on inside the political body. And that's what's got us in trouble. We're more interested in power and position and party. I'm sick of both parties. We better start focusing on the real problems in front of our country. We're going to have a $1.6 trillion deficit this year. And the way you get rid of a $1.6 trillion deficit is $1 billion or $2 billion or $3 billion at a time. Here's something that makes absolutely no sense. Here's something that has no true demand for it. Here's something that is $3 billion that the people we're paying to say they don't want the $3 billion, and we're not going to take them up on it? What part of stupid are we? I mean, you know, this is like a Pharaoh movie. It doesn't make sense. It's comedic. We've had a lot of debate. Let me just talk for a minute about what's going on in the agricultural community throughout this country. If you're a poultry, milk, or livestock producer. You can't bring your cattle to feedlots right now because the corn's too expensive. $7.65 a bushel yesterday. You can't afford to fatten your cattle, so they're not bringing them in from the range. We're slaughtering dairy cows all across this country because 70% of the cost of dairy cows is the corn that you feed them. We're going to get all sorts of untoward interruptions and price increases in our food if we continue this silly policy. 70% of the cost for chickens is feed. We're having chicken processors close and go into bankruptcy. We're having chicken raisers, the actual chicken farms, a lot in Oklahoma, a lot in Arkansas, a lot throughout the South, even over in Delaware and in Virginia. They can't afford to feed the chickens. So what's going to happen? Because we have this false subsidy. The fact is 15% right now of the food increases in this country that you've seen in the last year are directly associated with this policy. Directly associated with this policy. And that doesn't have any effect on the fact that what could we do by sending $7 corn out of this country to our balance of payments, which would help our trade imbalance. Instead, we're burning it. And it's a highly inefficient fuel. It's a highly inefficient fuel. Everybody knows that when they fill up with 15% or 10% ethanol, they get much poorer gas mileage. Everybody knows that. In Oklahoma, we have all these stations where it says ethanol free. And why do people pay 10 or 15 cents more a gallon? Because they win on mileage. They actually get better performance when they don't have ethanol in their fuel. We all know that. It's just in some states you don't have that option. We're fortunate. We can still buy real gas. I understand we have about 3 minutes left. I will close with the following statement. This is going to be a historic vote. Not about ethanol, not about subsidies. It's going to be a historic vote that sends a signal to the American people. Either the people in Washington get it and are going to stop wasting money on programs that they don't need to waste on, and they're going to start acting in the best long-term interests of the country. They're either going to do that or they're not. And so when we see the results of this vote, and you're going to have a hard time explaining, I voted against that because I didn't like the way the amendment came up. The fact is here's $3 billion that we don't have to spend over the next 6 months. And if we don't spend it, that's $3 billion we're not going to have to borrow from our children, and they're not going to be paying interest on for the next 30 years. This comes down to the point in time, does the Senate recognize the amount of trouble we're in, and are they willing to give up parochial interest, procedural interest? Are they willing to do what is necessary to put this country back on course? My hope and prayer is that they are. Madam President, I yield the floor.